All right, y'all, let's hem up this tie up top. So I've done most of the construction here and I'm ready to hem up. I have pressed my seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch, away from the center, and I just continued pressing that 1/2 inch all the way down to the bottom, narrowing the 1/2 inch down to nothing at the point. There is a little curve down here at the bottom that you have to ease in a little bit. I highly recommend giving it a really nice, hot, steamy press so it's nice and easy to work with and hem. I like to pull out my bobbin thread and give myself kind of a good amount of thread behind my presser foot here. That way I can kind of tug it along and make sure that that very tiny little point of the curve doesn't get sucked into the machine like it can sometimes. And now I'm just moving along. I'm using a triple step zigzag here. It's my favorite top stitching stitch on knits. Sewing a French terry here, so it actually isn't a very stretchy knit, but I like the way it looks, and I know that my little girl can tug and tug on this when she's tying and retying it, and it's not going to pop any stitches because it's a super high stretch stitch. I can also sew this stitch from the underside like I am here and make sure that my needle is kind of right where I want it. You can sew this on a cover stitch, but you're going to have to sew it from the top side, the right side facing up, like you always do on a cover stitch. Make sure you're not stretching your knit fabric as you're stitching along these ties. If you do, you'll end up with kind of not only much longer ties, but they'll kind of be misshapen in the end, especially if your fabric has a whole lot of vertical stretch. This French terry that I'm sewing barely has any vertical stretch at all, so my sewing machine is not even trying to stretch it because it really doesn't stretch at all. If you're sewing something that has a lot of vertical stretch, like a rayon, bamboo, modal, something like that, then you really have to be careful to make sure it's feeding through the machine nice and easily and not stretching as it feeds through the machine. If you're having a really difficult time and every time you go to stitch it, you feel like it's stretching out, something that you can use is a temporary hem tape. You want to make sure that it's a washable hem tape, something that is water soluble. That way, the first time you wash it, that hem tape will dissolve and you'll have all your stretch back. Hem tape, you just kind of iron it on in there and it will keep it from stretching. While you sew it, it also will keep it from stretching until you do wash it again. That's why you want to make sure to get the water soluble kind. That way you have your stretch back once you get it wet. Another thing a lot of people do is use tissue paper. I have never personally really done that. I've always reached for hem tape if I need the stability. I used to use hem tape on almost every single knit garment that I made. It does make it drastically easier to hem if you are a beginner and you're having a hard time hemming your knits without them stretching out. I highly recommend grabbing some water soluble hem tape. You really want to make sure it will wash out for you though. As we go towards the end, it kind of narrows down to nothing here. It can be kind of tricky even if your fabric holds a press. Sometimes I like to grab a pin like I am here and just kind of use that as a tiny little finger to help me hold it in place as I'm stitching down this very end. I find it a lot easier to stitch this little point on my sewing machine versus a cover stitch. I can go slower and I can really make sure I can get it from the underside versus using my cover stitch, which is faster and you have to sew from the top side. But in the end, it's really what you prefer the look on and which machine you're more comfortable with. So now we have that center kind of V all hemmed up. I'm going to want to press it, especially those little curves at the bottom. We'll give it a nice good press, and then we can just trim up at the top. I like to trim off the notches that showed you where to stop sewing, and I like to trim off these little corners. I always come to a V. You can kind of sew this into a squared off top. If you don't want to trim off these corners up here, you can kind of sew straight up across the middle and down in a squared off. I always do a V. I like the way it looks. So I trim off the little corners and then I trim off the notches. Next, we're going to go all the way from this end around the back of the shirt and down all the other outside tie. And what we're going to do is the same thing. We're just going to press 1/2 inch up to the wrong side, and then we're going to dwindle it down to nothing at this point. Okay, just like the opposite side. So I'm going to take that and press it. And here we go. So my other side is all pressed, and it goes again down the outside of the ties, around the back of the shirt, along the bottom, and then down the other side. There is this curve right here on the outside that you will have to ease in, right there. Again, pressing is such an important part of this. If you don't pre-press these little curves both on the end of the tie and kind of where it curves to meet the normal bottom of the shirt, it's going to be a lot harder to get a really nice finish on your hemming. Sometimes I like to stick a pin in, like I said before, to kind of help hold those really small pieces. Once again, just like I did on the other corner, I like to pull up my thread so that I can have a little bit to kind of hold and put some tension on to make sure my knit fabric on that teeny tiny little corner doesn't get sucked up into that sewing machine like it can sometimes. I'm just going to move my pin out of the way, and we're off. So just like we did the other side, not stretching at all as we're going down. We're going to ease in around that tiny little curve around the bottom. Then it's pretty straight. I'm doing the long ties, obviously, so I got a ways to go down these long ties. Of course, my favorite option and baby girl's favorite option ended up being the crop with the long ties. I had a little section right here that got eaten just a tiny bit, so I just trimmed it off. No big deal. Trim up the strings, and then we got a nice little corner on the bottom. So I was hemming for a lot with these long ties, but you know what? We both really love this option. It's so fun to be able to tie it really loose with a big floppy bow in front, or twist it around to the back for kind of a slimmer fit and the bow in the back. I'm going to speed up the video once I get around this curve. I'm just going to show me hemming around this curve and easing in this curve a little bit, just in case you're new to knits. You still don't want to stretch your fabric through as you're hemming around this curve, but the raw edge that is folded up is going to have to stretch to fit the curve. So as long as you press really well, you won't even notice that you're kind of stretching that folded up edge. Here's one more little trick I'm going to show before I speed up the rest of the hemming. If you have a bulkier fabric like me, I'm doing French terry, you can snip into your seam allowance, not through your seam allowance, but just up to your stitch line, and you can nest these seams right here so that your seam allowance can go to the front and then to the back, and so that way you don't have two seam allowances kind of going the same way and adding extra bulk. This is slightly smoother for your foot to kind of jump over while you're hemming over it. All right, now I'm going to speed up a little bit so I don't bore you too much. I'm just going to keep on keeping on stitching away with this triple step zigzag. Okay, we're rounding out towards the very bottom. Gonna ease in this little curve right here, being careful not to stretch out this little kind of teardrop shape at the bottom. I left my long my long thread here. I didn't trim it off. That way I can kind of hold it and kind of guide it through the machine at that very tiny corner. All right, and now we're done. All we have to do is trim our threads. We have a nice pretty little corner. I do need to press it here kind of back into that beautiful little teardrop shape, but we're done. It's a beautiful little tie. I love fabrics that kind of don't have a very obvious front and back for this. That way you don't have to be too careful about how you tie it. And the hemming kind of blends in really nicely. I'm gonna go for one last press and then you're done. Hopefully this video helped if you were struggling at all or maybe a little intimidated. I can't wait to see your tie up top.